Deep in the mist-shrouded hollers of Appalachian Kentucky, where federal maps still show empty spaces and cell towers refuse to function, the name Goins has been whispered for over 2 centuries. Not spoken aloud, mind you, but whispered like a prayer you're afraid might be answered. Local historians won't document their story. County records related to the family have a peculiar habit of disappearing from courthouse files. Even genealogy websites seem to glitch when researchers attempt to trace their bloodline too far back. There's a reason for this deliberate erasure, a reason that becomes clear once you understand what the Goins family truly represents in the darkest corners of American folklore. The winter of 1823 was the harshest in living memory when Ezekiel Goins first arrived in what would later become known as Devil's Backbone Ridge. He came alone, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and an aura of wrongness that made livestock nervous and children hide behind their mothers' skirts. The locals noticed immediately that wherever Ezekiel walked, the ground remained frozen long after spring arrived elsewhere. His shadow fell differently than other men's shadows, sometimes appearing to move independently of his body, sometimes stretching impossibly long even at midday. Within a month of his arrival, Ezekiel had claimed a plot of land that no one else wanted, a steep-sided hollow where nothing had ever grown properly and where hunters reported their dogs refused to track game. The deed was filed under circumstances that no one could quite remember clearly afterward. The county clerk, when asked years later, would only say that the transaction had felt like a dream he couldn't quite wake up from. But it was what Ezekiel built on that cursed land that first marked the Goins family as something beyond ordinary mountain folk. His cabin defied architectural logic, constructed with rooms that seemed larger inside than the exterior walls should allow. Visitors, on the rare occasions they were permitted, described hallways that led to doors that opened onto the same room they'd just left, windows that showed different seasons depending on the time of day you looked through them. Most disturbing of all, a cellar that descended far deeper into the mountain than any foundation should require, with stone steps that grew progressively colder as you descended until your breath misted even in summer heat. The first generation of Goins' children exhibited peculiarities that the community initially attributed to mountain isolation. They aged differently than normal children, sometimes appearing to grow several years older in a matter of months, other times remaining unchanged for years at a time. Their eyes reflected light, like nocturnal animals, and they possessed an uncanny ability to predict deaths in the community days before they occurred. Most unsettling was their habit of speaking in perfect unison when addressing outsiders, as though sharing a single consciousness distributed among multiple bodies. By 1847, the Goins family had established patterns that would persist for generations. They operated a general store that somehow always had goods available, even during the harshest winters when supply routes were impossible. Customers noted that items purchased from the Goins store lasted far longer than they should, with some reporting that flour bought from them never seemed to diminish, no matter how much they used. But there was always a price beyond money. Families who traded regularly with the Goins found themselves increasingly isolated from their neighbors, as though something about the transactions marked them in ways that other mountain folk instinctively recognized and avoided. The Civil War brought federal attention to the remote hollows for the first time, and with it, the first documented attempts to investigate the Goins family officially. Union forces establishing supply lines through the region reported strange encounters with what they assumed were Confederate sympathizers. Soldiers described meeting Goins family members who seemed to know details about troop movements that should have been impossible for civilians to possess. More disturbing were reports of entire patrol units becoming lost in areas they had successfully navigated multiple times before, wandering in circles for days in terrain that maps showed as straightforward mountain passes. Captain Marcus Thornfield of the 5th Kentucky Infantry left detailed records of his unit's encounter with the Goins homestead in October 1863. His journal, discovered in family papers nearly a century later, describes approaching the property to requisition supplies for his men. What he found challenged his understanding of reality itself. The cabin appeared to shift and change as they watched, sometimes appearing as a modest mountain dwelling, other times revealing itself as a structure far too large and complex to exist in that location. When Thornfield demanded to speak with the head of the household, he was greeted by what appeared to be the same man emerging from 3 different doors simultaneously. Each figure claimed to be Ezekiel Goins. Each spoke with identical voices, and each seemed completely unaware of the other's presence. The captain's men reported feeling an overwhelming urge to flee, describing a sensation like being watched by something vast and hungry that existed just beyond their perception. The requisition was completed without incident, but the supplies provided by the Goins family had unexpected effects. Hardtack that should have lasted days fed Thornfield's entire unit for weeks. Ammunition fired from weapons loaded with Goins-provided powder never seemed to miss their targets, but soldiers reported that the sound of these shots echoed strangely, as though the gunfire originated from somewhere much deeper underground than their rifle barrels. Most troubling, several of Thornfield's men began experiencing shared dreams of vast underground spaces filled with machinery that predated human civilization. The captain's final journal entry regarding the Goins family, dated November 15, 1863, reads simply, "We have been marked by our transaction. The men speak of hearing voices calling their names from deep within the mountain. I fear we have purchased more than supplies." Thornfield's unit was reported missing in action 3 days later. Confederate records make no mention of engaging Union forces in that area during the relevant time period. The men were never found, though local legend claims that on certain winter nights, the sound of marching boots can still be heard echoing from the depths of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Following the war, the Goins family's influence expanded dramatically. They established what appeared to be legitimate business enterprises throughout eastern Kentucky, but each venture carried the same otherworldly characteristics as their original general store. A lumber mill that processed timber faster than mechanically possible, with wood that showed grain patterns resembling symbols in no known language. A grain elevator that somehow produced more flour than the wheat delivered to it should have yielded. A postal service that delivered letters to recipients who had died years earlier and occasionally delivered messages that had been written decades before the postal system was established. The family's most significant expansion came through what locals called the Goins marriages. Unlike typical mountain families who married within established communities, the Goins actively sought marriage partners from distant locations, often appearing at community gatherings hundreds of miles away with uncanny timing. Prospective spouses were reported being drawn to Goins family members through dreams that began weeks before they actually met. These dreams consistently featured the same imagery: vast underground chambers filled with an amber colored light, voices speaking in harmonies that human throats shouldn't be able to produce, and the overwhelming sensation of being selected for some crucial but undefined purpose. Martha Whitmore of Breathitt County described her courtship with Jeremiah Goins in letters to her sister that were discovered after her disappearance in 1871. She wrote of dreams so vivid they felt more real than her waking life, of knowledge appearing in her mind without explanation, and of a growing compulsion to travel to Devil's Backbone Ridge despite having no logical reason to make such a journey. Marriage into the Goins family transformed individuals in ways that their original communities found deeply unsettling. Spouses would return for brief visits, exhibiting knowledge they couldn't possibly possess, speaking languages they had never learned, and demonstrating skills that required years of training to develop. Sarah Mackenzie, who married into the family in 1869, shocked her Methodist congregation by delivering a sermon in perfect Latin despite having never received formal education. When questioned about this newfound ability, she replied that the words had simply been there when she needed them, as though they had always existed in her mind, waiting to be discovered. More disturbing were the physical changes. Goins' spouses developed the same reflective eye quality as blood relatives, the same resistance to normal aging processes, and the same unsettling habit of sometimes appearing to be in multiple locations simultaneously. Community members reported conversations with individuals who were simultaneously present at their own homes miles away, leading to widespread speculation about the true nature of what marriage into the Goins family actually entailed. The children produced by these unions exhibited abilities that transcended the already unusual characteristics of previous Goins generations. They demonstrated precognitive abilities so precise that local law enforcement began consulting them unofficially about potential crimes. They could locate lost objects, missing persons, and hidden resources with supernatural accuracy. Most remarkably, they seemed to share experiences across vast distances, with children in different states simultaneously reacting to events affecting their relatives. By 1885, the Goins family network had spread across 7 states, with each branch maintaining the same impossible characteristics as the original Devil's Backbone Ridge settlement. They operated businesses that defied economic logic, maintained properties that challenged architectural understanding, and preserved family traditions that anthropologists struggled to categorize. Yet despite their growing influence, they remained largely invisible to official documentation, as though some force actively prevented their activities from being recorded in any permanent form. The few government officials who attempted to investigate the Goins enterprises found themselves confronting bureaucratic obstacles that bordered on the supernatural. Documents would disappear from locked files, witnesses would suddenly become unable to recall crucial details, and investigators would find themselves reassigned to distant locations without explanation. A Treasury Department inquiry into suspected tax evasion by Goins-owned businesses was abruptly terminated in 1889 when the lead investigator was found in his Washington office, physically unharmed but completely unable to remember his own name or recognize his own family. The Goins family's most disturbing characteristic, however, was their relationship with death itself. Unlike other mountain families who grieved their losses and maintained normal burial practices, the Goins seemed to view death as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent separation. Family members who died would continue to appear at community gatherings, participate in business transactions, and maintain their roles in family decisions. These appearances were witnessed by numerous unrelated individuals who had no reason to fabricate such accounts. Reverend Samuel Crawford, a traveling Methodist minister who served the region for 30 years, documented multiple encounters with deceased Goins family members in his personal journal. He described attending what he believed was a funeral for Ezekiel Goins in 1878, only to have the supposedly deceased patriarch participate actively in the service, delivering a eulogy for himself that lasted 3 hours and contained prophecies about events that wouldn't occur for decades. Crawford's journal notes that other mourners seemed to find nothing unusual about this arrangement, suggesting that such occurrences were routine within the Goins family structure. The Reverend's most disturbing entry, dated December 21st, 1882, describes a Christmas service where he counted 47 Goins family members in attendance, despite knowing that only 19 were officially alive according to county records. When he questioned community members about this discrepancy, they assured him that all the attendees were family members in good standing, though they seemed unable to explain the mathematical impossibility of their numbers. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Goins family had established themselves as an integral part of Appalachian life, while remaining completely separate from normal human society. They had created a parallel civilization that operated according to rules that predated recorded history, maintained traditions that connected them to forces beyond human understanding, and preserved the knowledge that governments and academic institutions seemed powerless to document or control. The mountain folk who lived alongside them developed an unspoken understanding. The Goins family provided services that no one else could offer, solved problems that conventional methods couldn't address, and maintained stability in a region where survival often depended on accepting help from sources you didn't fully understand. In exchange, the community agreed not to ask too many questions about methods that defied explanation, business practices that ignored economic reality, and family traditions that challenged everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the nature of human existence itself. But this delicate balance between the Goins family and the world around them was about to face its greatest challenge. The 20th century would bring technologies, institutions, and ways of thinking that had never before encountered the ancient forces that the Goins family represented. The turn of the 20th century marked a crucial inflection point for the Goins family dynasty. As America lurched toward modernity, with electric lights piercing the darkness and railroad tracks cutting through ancient valleys, the supernatural order that had sheltered the family for generations faced its gravest threat yet. The age of documentation had arrived. Census takers Federal surveyors and territorial administrators armed with cameras and typewriters began venturing into regions that had remained unmapped for decades. What they discovered challenged not just bureaucratic understanding, but the very foundations of recorded reality itself. By 1901, three separate government expeditions had attempted to conduct official surveys of Devil's Backbone Ridge. The first team, comprising two cartographers and a territorial clerk, arrived in early spring with precise instruments and federal mandates. They established base camp near what appeared to be the Goins homestead, noting in their initial reports that the family seemed remarkably welcoming for mountain folk typically suspicious of government intrusion. Ezekiel Goins, now impossibly ancient, yet moving with the vitality of a much younger man, personally guided the surveyors through the property. Their final report, discovered decades later in a misfiled archive, contained disturbing inconsistencies. Measurements taken of the same structures varied wildly from day to day. A cabin recorded as 43 feet in length on Monday measured 68 feet by Thursday, with no evidence of construction between surveys. Most troubling were the photographic plates. Images of family members showed faces that seemed to shift between exposures, ages that fluctuated impossibly, and shadows that fell in directions contrary to the sun's position. The lead surveyor's personal journal, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, documented his growing unease. The Goins children play games no Christian family should know, he wrote. Today I watched young Martha, who cannot be more than 8 years old, speak fluent Latin to something invisible standing beside the well. When I approached, she switched to English and asked if I had met her grandmother's grandmother, who had been waiting to speak with me. The surveyor's final entry, dated 3 weeks into their stay, consisted of a single repeated phrase written hundreds of times. The mountain remembers everything. The mountain remembers everything. The survey team emerged from the ridge after 5 weeks, their equipment mysteriously damaged, and their records so contradictory that the territorial office declared the entire expedition a failure. All 3 men resigned from federal service within months, citing health concerns that medical examination could not diagnose. The second expedition, launched in 1903 with military oversight, lasted exactly 1 day. The commanding officer's terse report stated simply, "Terrain unsuitable for survey." When pressed for details, he responded that his men had encountered geographical impossibilities incompatible with federal mapping standards and refused further elaboration. The third and final attempt came in 1907, led by a Harvard anthropologist named Dr. Edmund Thornfield, who had gained fame documenting isolated communities throughout Appalachia. Dr. Thornfield approached the Goins family with academic curiosity rather than administrative necessity, seeking to record their unique customs and dialect for scholarly publication. His methodology was meticulous, employing both written documentation and Edison wax cylinder recordings to preserve their oral traditions. For the first time in their documented history, the Goins family appeared genuinely concerned about outside attention. Family meetings, previously conducted in the open with their characteristic disregard for privacy, now took place behind closed doors. Children who had always greeted strangers with uncanny knowledge of their personal histories suddenly became shy and withdrawn. Most significantly, the impossible architecture of their homestead began conforming to conventional physical laws, as though the family were actively suppressing their supernatural manifestations. He documented rituals that blended Christian imagery with practices he could not identify, a dialect that incorporated words from languages that predated European settlement, and social structures that seemed to operate on principles entirely foreign to anthropological understanding. The Goins family maintains genealogical records extending back centuries, he wrote, yet their method of documentation defies conventional chronology. They speak of ancestors as though they remain actively involved in family decisions, referring to long-dead relatives in present tense. Each generation selected one child to serve as the repository of accumulated family knowledge. This chosen individual underwent a process the family described as the deepening, emerging with access to memories that spanned multiple lifetimes. The current memory keeper, a woman named Prudence Goins, who appeared to be in her 30s but claimed to remember the family's original arrival in Kentucky, demonstrated abilities that challenged Dr. Thornfield's scientific worldview. Prudence possesses intimate knowledge of every significant event in regional history, he documented. She describes the winter of 1834 with the precision of someone who experienced it firsthand, including details about individuals who left no historical record. When I tested her knowledge against documented facts, she corrected errors in official accounts, providing information that later research confirmed as accurate. His journal entries describe periods where he seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple time periods, witnessing events from the family's past while remaining consciously present in 1907. During these episodes, he claimed to observe the original Ezekiel Goins conducting the rituals that first established the family's supernatural connections, watching from the perspective of someone who had always been part of their community. The boundaries between past and present dissolve entirely in their presence, he wrote. I have attended family gatherings where deceased relatives participate as fully as the living, sharing meals and offering advice as though death were merely a temporary absence. Yesterday, I spent an afternoon with Ezekiel's wife, Martha, learning traditional cooking methods. Only later did I realize that Martha died in 1856, according to the family's own records. The anthropologist's final report to Harvard, submitted after 6 months with the family, recommended that all academic study of the Goins family be permanently discontinued. There are aspects of human experience that academic inquiry cannot safely investigate, he concluded. The Goins family represents a form of existence that challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which scholarly research is based. Dr. Thornfield never returned to academic life. He settled in a cabin near Devil's Backbone Ridge, becoming increasingly reclusive and speaking only to the handful of locals who still acknowledged his existence. Those who encountered him in his later years described a man who seemed to age backwards, growing younger and more vital as the decades passed. He was last seen in 1952, appearing to be no older than 30, despite being well into his 80s, according to university records. The federal government's response to these failed expeditions was characteristically bureaucratic and thoroughly supernatural. Rather than acknowledging the impossibility of documenting the Goins family through conventional means, administrative policy simply evolved to accommodate their existence outside normal parameters. Devil's Backbone Ridge was quietly reclassified as unsuitable for standard territorial documentation and removed from official survey requirements. This department, staffed by individuals who had demonstrated unusual tolerance for supernatural phenomena, developed alternative methods for managing populations that existed outside conventional reality. Their approach involved creating parallel documentation systems that could accommodate impossible genealogies, fluctuating census numbers, and geographic locations that changed according to supernatural rather than physical laws. The Goins family's influence on this bureaucratic evolution extended far beyond their own documentation. Other supernatural families throughout Appalachia found themselves similarly exempted from standard administrative procedures. A network of understanding officials emerged, individuals who had learned to process impossible information without questioning its fundamental contradictions. These officials developed their own informal protocols, creating a shadow administrative system that operated alongside conventional government structures. By 1910, this shadow system had evolved into an unofficial but highly effective parallel bureaucracy. Supernatural families could obtain legitimate documentation for births, deaths, property transfers, and business licenses through channels that bypassed normal verification procedures. Officials within this system learned to file reports that satisfied federal requirements while carefully omitting details that would challenge bureaucratic sanity. The Goins family's business enterprises expanded dramatically during this period of administrative accommodation. No longer constrained by the need to avoid government attention, they began operating openly across multiple states. Goins Trading Company established offices in Charleston, Lexington, and Knoxville, offering services that defied conventional business categories. Their official corporate documents, filed with various state governments, listed their primary business as consultation and problem resolution, a description so vague that it could encompass virtually any activity. Clients sought out Goins services for challenges that conventional businesses could not address. Agricultural problems that had resisted all known solutions would mysteriously resolve after Goins' consultation. Legal disputes that had dragged through courts for years would suddenly settle in ways that satisfied all parties. Most significantly, families dealing with supernatural problems of their own could obtain assistance that no other organization could provide. The family's approach to these consultations maintained their characteristic blend of the mundane and the impossible. A typical Goins business meeting might begin with conventional discussion of fees and timelines, conducted in a perfectly normal office with standard furniture and filing cabinets. However, as the consultation progressed, participants would gradually realize that the conversation was being informed by knowledge that no conventional research could have obtained. Solutions would emerge that addressed not just the immediate problem, but underlying issues that the client had never mentioned or even recognized. Payment for Goins services rarely involved conventional currency. Instead, clients found themselves entering into agreements that encompassed obligations extending far beyond simple financial transactions. These agreements, while always honored precisely, often included terms that only became clear years or decades after the original consultation. A farmer seeking help with crop failures might find his land producing unprecedented harvests for generations, while his family gradually developed unusual abilities or attracted supernatural attention that created entirely new challenges. The family's most significant business expansion during this period involved their entry into the emerging industrial economy. As coal mining and timber operations transformed the Appalachian landscape, the Goins family positioned themselves as intermediaries between conventional businesses and the supernatural forces that industrial development was disturbing. Mining companies that had ignored local warnings about cursed ground would find their operations plagued by inexplicable accidents until they sought Goins' consultation. Timber operations that had clear-cut sacred groves would face equipment failures and worker injuries that conventional safety measures could not prevent. The Goins family's approach to these industrial consultations revealed sophisticated understanding of both supernatural dynamics and modern business practices. They would negotiate agreements that satisfied the immediate needs of industrial clients while establishing long-term relationships that ensured ongoing revenue streams. A mining company might receive supernatural protection for their operations in exchange for regular payments and adherence to specific protocols that honored the displaced entities they had disturbed. These industrial relationships created a new category of Goins family member, individuals who could operate effectively in both supernatural and conventional business environments. These family members developed skills that allowed them to attend corporate board meetings in New York City and participate in ancient mountain rituals with equal competence. They learned to speak the language of profit margins and production quotas while maintaining their connection to supernatural forces that could make or break industrial operations. The family's success in bridging these two worlds attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Representatives of major corporations began seeking Goins' consultation not just for supernatural problems, but for conventional business challenges that had proven intractable through normal means. Railroad companies dealing with labor disputes that threatened critical construction deadlines would discover that Goins' intervention could produce solutions that satisfied workers, management, and schedules simultaneously. Most remarkably, the family began receiving consultation requests from government officials dealing with problems that conventional administrative approaches could not resolve. Regional conflicts that had resisted diplomatic solution for decades would mysteriously settle after discreet Goins' involvement. Federal investigations that had stalled due to lack of evidence would suddenly uncover crucial information through channels that investigators could never quite explain. These government relationships operated through the same shadow bureaucracy that had emerged to accommodate the family's documentation needs. Officials who had learned to process impossible information without questioning its source became conduits for Goins' influence within federal administration. This influence was always exercised subtly, creating solutions that appeared to emerge through conventional means while actually resulting from supernatural intervention. By 1915, the Goins family had achieved something unprecedented in American supernatural history: full integration into both conventional and shadow economies while maintaining their fundamental supernatural nature. They operated legitimate businesses that generated substantial conventional revenue while simultaneously providing services that existed entirely outside normal commercial categories. Their success created a model that other supernatural families throughout the country began attempting to replicate. However, this integration came with costs that would not become apparent until decades later. The family's increasing involvement with conventional institutions required them to maintain ever more complex deceptions about their true nature. Children who had grown up thinking their supernatural abilities were normal now had to learn to hide these capabilities when interacting with conventional society. Family meetings that had once been open celebrations of their supernatural heritage became carefully guarded secrets. Most significantly, the family's expansion beyond their traditional Appalachian territory began diluting their connection to the supernatural forces that had originally empowered them. Family members operating in distant cities reported that their abilities were less reliable, their supernatural insights less clear. The ancient rituals that had sustained the family for generations became more difficult to perform as family members scattered across the continent. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Goins family stood at the pinnacle of their influence and the beginning of their greatest challenge. They had successfully adapted to the modern world without losing their supernatural essence, but the very success of this adaptation was beginning to threaten the foundations of their power. The 20th century would test whether they could maintain their supernatural heritage while continuing to operate in an increasingly documented and interconnected world. The mountain itself seemed to sense this transition. The winter of 1862 brought changes to the Goins family that would forever alter their relationship with the encroaching modern world. As the nation tore itself apart in the Civil War, the hollow of Devil's Backbone Ridge remained untouched by Union or Confederate forces alike. Maps of the region showed only blank spaces where their territory lay, and scouts from both armies reported becoming hopelessly lost whenever they ventured too close to the crooked homestead. But Ezekiel Goins had been preparing for this moment since his arrival decades earlier. He understood that war created opportunities for those willing to seize them, and that bureaucratic chaos could be exploited by families with the right connections to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The family's first major expansion came through what appeared to be simple war profiteering. Abraham Goins, now appearing to be in his 40s despite being born over 30 years prior, established a series of supply contracts with military quartermasters on both sides of the conflict. The Goins family suddenly controlled vast networks of grain, ammunition, and medical supplies that moved through the mountains with supernatural efficiency. Wagon trains that should have taken weeks to traverse the treacherous terrain arrived at their destinations in mere days, their drivers reporting strange dreams and lost time. More concerning were the medical supplies themselves. Surgeons who used Goins provided morphine and bandages reported miraculous healing rates among their patients, but also noted disturbing side effects. Wounded soldiers would recover from injuries that should have been fatal, but they returned to their units changed in subtle ways. Their eyes reflected light differently in darkness. They could navigate without compasses, even in unfamiliar territory, and they seemed to hear orders that their officers never gave. These transformed soldiers became conduits for the family's influence throughout the military hierarchy. By war's end, the Goins network had infiltrated command structures on both sides, creating a shadow organization that transcended political boundaries. Officers who had never met the family directly found themselves making decisions that benefited Goins' interests, compelled by impulses they couldn't quite explain. The post-war period saw the family's most audacious expansion yet. As the federal government struggled to rebuild the nation, the Goinses positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries in the mountains. They controlled not just supply lines, but information networks, using their supernatural abilities to gather intelligence that made them valuable to Reconstruction officials and carpetbaggers alike. Jeremiah Goins, the youngest of Ezekiel's documented children, demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict political developments months in advance. His counsel became sought after by industrialists looking to invest in Appalachian resources, though none of them could later recall exactly how they had first made contact with him. Mining companies that followed Jeremiah's advice discovered coal seams in locations their surveys had dismissed as worthless. Railroad executives who consulted with him found their tracks running through mountain passes that hadn't existed on previous maps. The family's business practices during this period defied conventional understanding. They established companies that existed in multiple states simultaneously without proper incorporation papers, yet somehow avoided legal challenges. Their contracts were enforced by courts that had no jurisdiction over their territory, and their disputes were resolved through arbitration processes that no legal scholar could identify or explain. Most unsettling was their approach to labor relations. The Goins family controlled mines, timber operations, and emerging industrial ventures throughout Appalachia, yet they never faced the strikes or unrest that plagued their competitors. Workers in Goins-controlled operations reported unusual loyalty to their employers, describing their jobs as more than mere employment. They spoke of feeling connected to something larger than themselves, of understanding their role in a grand design that stretched far beyond their individual circumstances. These workers exhibited remarkable coordination without apparent communication. In emergencies, entire crews would respond to dangers before alarm bells rang. During accidents, they would organize rescue efforts with precision that suggested advanced planning, even when the incidents were clearly unforeseen. Most disturbing of all, worker fatalities in Goins operations always occurred in numbers that matched specific patterns, as though death itself operated according to schedules only the family understood. The family's influence extended into emerging technologies as well. When telegraph lines first reached Appalachian communities, Goins-controlled territories somehow received service before more established towns. The messages transmitted through their network carried additional information that standard telegraphy couldn't account for. Operators reported receiving signals that contained more data than the equipment should have been able to process, and decoded messages that included details the original senders claimed never to have transmitted. Railroad construction through Goins territory proceeded with impossible speed and precision. Survey teams working on family land would complete mapping assignments in fractions of the expected time, returning with detailed topographical information and geological surveys that would have required months of careful study. When questioned about their methods, these surveyors could only describe experiencing unusual clarity of thought and purpose while working in Goins-controlled areas. The most significant development came with the establishment of the Goins Territorial Trust in 1874, a legal entity that existed in a gray area between federal, state, and local jurisdictions. The trust controlled vast holdings across multiple states, yet its actual ownership structure remained deliberately obscured. Legal documents referenced family members using names that appeared in no census records, and corporate structures that seemed to exist outside conventional business law. Through the trust, the family began acquiring properties with strategic value that wouldn't become apparent for decades. They purchased seemingly worthless mountain land that would later prove to contain valuable mineral deposits. They secured water rights along rivers that would become crucial transportation routes. Most prescient of all, they acquired parcels near communities that would eventually grow into major industrial centers, positioning themselves to profit from developments they seemed to anticipate long before anyone else recognized their potential. The trust also served as a mechanism for the family's most ambitious project yet, the creation of a parallel governmental structure within their territory. While maintaining the appearance of compliance with federal and state authority, the Goinses established their own system of law enforcement, dispute resolution, and resource management. Local sheriffs and federal marshals found their jurisdiction mysteriously unclear when dealing with Goins properties, often discovering that their legal authority ended at boundaries that weren't marked on any official maps. This shadow governance operated through a network of individuals who held official positions in legitimate government agencies, but whose primary loyalty lay with the family. County clerks, postal officials, tax assessors, and even federal bureaucrats found themselves making decisions that served Goins' interests, often without consciously realizing they were doing so. These individuals would later describe feeling compelled to act in ways that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, only to discover afterward that their actions had benefited the family in ways they hadn't anticipated. The most troubling aspect of this influence was its apparent permanence. Officials who left their positions and moved far from Goins' territory continued to advocate for family interests in their new locations. They established business relationships, political connections, and social networks that invariably created opportunities for the Goinses to expand their influence into previously untouched regions. By the 1880s, the family's network extended from the original Kentucky Hollow to major cities throughout the eastern United States. They maintained interests in shipping companies operating out of Charleston and Norfolk, manufacturing concerns in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, and financial institutions in New York and Philadelphia. Yet despite this vast commercial empire, the family members themselves remained largely invisible to public scrutiny. Newspaper accounts of the period occasionally mentioned Goins' business activities, but never in ways that suggested the full scope of their operations. Reporters who attempted to investigate the family found their stories killed by editors who couldn't explain their reluctance to publish. Those who persisted in their inquiries often discovered that their sources had mysteriously become unavailable, their documents had been lost or destroyed, and their own memories of the investigation had become frustratingly unclear. The family's approach to wealth differed fundamentally from other industrial dynasties of the era. While contemporaries, like the Rockefellers and Carnegies, built visible monuments to their success, the Goinses seemed more interested in creating systems than accumulating obvious symbols of power. Their wealth flowed through complex networks of investments and holdings that made it impossible to calculate their true financial position. Yet their influence could be detected in nearly every major economic development in Appalachian regions. More unsettling was their relationship with death during this period of expansion. Industrial accidents were common throughout American industry in the late 19th century, but the pattern of fatalities in Goins controlled operations suggested something beyond mere workplace hazards. Workers died at regular intervals that corresponded to lunar cycles and seasonal changes, as though their deaths served purposes beyond simple misfortune. Families of these deceased workers reported strange occurrences following the funerals. They would find tools and personal effects belonging to the dead arranged in their homes in ways no living person could have managed. Children would wake from dreams claiming to have received messages from their deceased fathers or brothers, messages that invariably contained practical advice about family finances or warnings about future dangers. Most disturbing of all, some families reported seeing their deceased relatives working alongside living crews during nighttime operations, visible only in peripheral vision and gone whenever directly observed. These phenomena created a workforce that existed partially beyond the boundaries of life and death, allowing the family to maintain operations that required more labor than they officially employed. Mine shafts produced coal tonnage that exceeded what their documented workforce could have extracted. Timber operations cleared forest acres faster than their equipment and personnel should have allowed. Railroad construction proceeded around the clock without the overtime costs that such schedules should have required. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Goins family had successfully transformed from mysterious mountain settlers into a supernatural industrial dynasty that operated parallel to and often in control of legitimate American institutions. Their success had created a template for power that transcended the traditional understanding of business, politics, and even mortality itself. Yet this expansion came with its own risks. The very systems they had created to extend their influence also made them more vulnerable to the forces of modernization that were reshaping American society. Documentation requirements, federal oversight, and interconnected communication networks that had served their purposes during their expansion now threatened to expose the supernatural foundations of their empire. The family stood at a crossroads as the new century approached. They had achieved influence beyond anything their mysterious origins might have suggested possible, but they had also created dependencies on systems they couldn't fully control. The question facing them wasn't whether they could maintain their power, but whether they could evolve quickly enough to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly transparent, regulated, and connected. In the depths of Devil's Backbone Ridge, where the crooked homestead still stood despite decades of apparent abandonment, something ancient stirred with anticipation. The bargains struck in that otherworldly place had been honored through decades of expansion and influence, but the entities that had made those original agreements were beginning to demand new forms of payment, new expressions of the power they had helped create. By 1923, the forces that had sustained the Goins family's empire for a century began to show their first cracks. The modern world was catching up to their ancient arrangements, and what had once been hidden in Appalachian mist was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Government record keeping had grown more thorough, Communication networks reached deeper into remote territories, and most dangerously, outsiders were beginning to ask questions that previous generations had been too afraid to voice. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source, the United States Census Bureau. For decades, the Goins had managed to slip through bureaucratic gaps, maintaining their influence while avoiding official documentation. But the 1920 census brought federal agents into territories where they'd never ventured before, armed with new mandates to document every citizen, every business, every structure of significance. When census taker Margaret Holloway arrived in Devil's Backbone Ridge on a crisp October morning, she carried forms that demanded answers the Goins family had never been forced to provide. The meeting took place in what appeared to be the family's main residence, though Margaret would later write in her private journal that the building seemed to shift dimensions when she wasn't looking directly at it. Rooms that appeared spacious from the outside felt cramped within, while hallways stretched longer than the structure's exterior could possibly contain. Ezekiel Goins, now appearing to be in his 70s, despite being born in 1823, received her with courteous hospitality that somehow felt more threatening than outright hostility. The census questions seemed simple enough. How many people lived in the household? What were their occupations? What was the family's primary source of income? But as Margaret attempted to record the answers, she discovered that her pen would not function properly. The ink would flow normally until she tried to write down specific details about the Goins family, at which point it would either run dry or produce illegible marks that resembled no letters she recognized. Ezekiel watched her struggles with patient amusement. Government papers don't seem to take to our family, he observed in his peculiar accent that seemed to shift between dialects with each sentence. Margaret persisted, switching to pencil, then to a different pen, then to making notes on the back of other forms. Each attempt yielded the same result. She could write about other families in the region without difficulty, but any specific information about the Goins would simply refuse to be recorded. More unsettling was her growing realization that she was having trouble remembering exactly what Ezekiel had told her moments after he spoke. The facts seemed to slip from her mind like water through cupped hands. When she left the ridge that afternoon, Margaret carried with her a census form that contained more blank spaces than completed entries. Her superiors in the regional office initially blamed faulty equipment, but when 3 additional census takers experienced identical difficulties, the Bureau quietly classified the Goins family documentation as incomplete due to technical difficulties. The truth was carefully omitted from official reports, but bureaucratic frustration was the least of the family's concerns. The real threat came from a source they had not anticipated: their own success. The Goins business empire had grown so extensive and so profitable that it was beginning to attract attention from competitors, investigators, and federal agencies that specialized in detecting fraud. Their coal operations produced yields that defied geological surveys. Their manufacturing concerns created products using techniques that patent offices could not classify. Their financial institutions offered services that banking regulators could not understand or approve. In 1924, Treasury Department investigator William Ashford arrived in eastern Kentucky as part of a broader inquiry into tax evasion by mining companies. Unlike the census takers, Ashford came prepared for unusual difficulties. He'd built his reputation by unraveling financial schemes that others had deemed impossible to investigate. His methodical approach and stubborn persistence had exposed corruption in industries from steel to railroads. The Goins family represented exactly the kind of challenge he relished. Ashford's investigation began conventionally enough. He examined bank records, cross-referenced shipping manifests, interviewed employees and business partners. But as he delved deeper into the Goins operations, he encountered anomalies that his training had not prepared him to handle. Financial records that existed in multiple banks simultaneously, but with different information in each copy. Shipping documents that described cargo loads exceeding the physical capacity of the vessels allegedly carrying them. Employee testimony that contradicted itself within single interviews, as if the speakers were remembering different versions of the same events. Most puzzling were the mining reports. According to official surveys, the Goins coal operations were extracting material from seams that geological science insisted were exhausted decades earlier. When Ashford requested permission to inspect the mines personally, he was granted access without resistance. Ezekiel Goins himself offered to guide the tour, displaying the same courteous cooperation that had frustrated the census takers. The mine entrance appeared normal enough, a standard shaft descending into the mountain with proper timber supports and adequate ventilation. But as they proceeded deeper, Ashford noticed that his compass began behaving erratically, spinning without settling on any consistent direction. The air grew warmer rather than cooler as they descended, and the walls seemed to emit a faint luminescence that made their lanterns almost unnecessary. Ashford asked, consulting his pocket watch to estimate how long they'd been walking downward. Ezekiel's answer was characteristically evasive. "Deep enough to meet our needs, Mr. Ashford." The coalface, when they finally reached it, defied every principle of mining engineering Ashford understood. The seam extended in directions that should have intersected with other mine shafts, yet somehow maintained its integrity. The coal itself possessed an unusual quality, burning with an intensity and duration that made it extraordinarily valuable, yet chemical analysis had never been able to identify what gave it these properties. "This is remarkable," Ashford admitted, running his hands along the coal face. "The mountain has always been generous to our family," Ezekiel replied. It was then that Ashford noticed the silence, the usual sounds of a working mine, the distant echoes of equipment, the movement of air through ventilation shafts, all were absent. The only sound was their own breathing and the soft scrape of their footsteps. When he mentioned this observation, Ezekiel's expression grew thoughtful. "Sound travels differently down here," he said. As they prepared to return to the surface, Ashford attempted to make sketches of the mine layout in his notebook. Like the census takers before him, he discovered that his writing instruments would not function properly in the depths. Pencil marks appeared faded and illegible, ink refused to flow, and even scratches made with his fingernail in the coal dust seemed to fade moments after he made them. The return journey felt significantly shorter than their descent, though Ashford's pocket watch insisted they had been underground for over 4 hours. When they emerged into daylight, he was surprised to find that the sun appeared to be in the same position it had occupied when they entered the mine. Ashford's official report to the Treasury Department was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language that managed to convey absolutely nothing of substance. Privately, however, Ashford was deeply troubled by his experience. His personal journal, discovered years later among his effects, revealed a man struggling to reconcile his professional skepticism with encounters that challenged his understanding of reality itself. There is something about the Goins family that exists outside normal categories, he wrote. They operate according to rules that I cannot identify or understand. The Treasury Department quietly closed its investigation, but word of the unusual findings spread through federal law enforcement circles. The Goins family found themselves the subject of increasing scrutiny from agencies they had previously never encountered. Postal inspectors began monitoring their correspondence, though letters addressed to family members had a tendency to become lost in transit or arrive with their contents mysteriously altered. Federal marshals started making regular patrols through their territory, though these officials invariably reported that everything appeared normal, even as they struggled to remember specific details of what they had observed. Most concerning to the family was the attention they began receiving from academic researchers. Anthropologists from major universities started visiting the region, drawn by rumors of unusual cultural practices and unexplained phenomena. Unlike government investigators, who were constrained by bureaucratic procedures and legal requirements, these scholars approached the Goins family with genuine curiosity and fewer preconceptions about what was possible. Dr. Helena Marsden from the University of Chicago arrived in 1925 as part of a broader study of Appalachian folk traditions. Her initial interest in the Goins family was purely academic, focused on their reputation as skilled craftsmen and successful businessmen in a region where most families struggled with poverty. But her interviews with local residents revealed a pattern of stories that went far beyond ordinary mountain folklore. People spoke of the Goins family in whispers, with a mixture of respect and fear that Dr. Marsden found intriguing. They were credited with impossible feats, predicting weather patterns months in advance, finding water in drought conditions, healing injuries that should have been fatal. Yet they were also associated with darker rumors, livestock deaths that followed disputes with family members, mysterious disappearances of those who challenged their authority, and strange lights that appeared over their property during certain phases of the moon. Dr. Marsden's first meeting with the family took place at their invitation, delivered through an intermediary in a manner that suggested they were aware of her research and had decided to cooperate. She was received at what appeared to be their main residence, though like other visitors, she found the building's architecture somewhat disorienting. Rooms seemed to be arranged according to principles that had little to do with conventional geometry, and she occasionally found herself in spaces that she could not locate again when she attempted to retrace her steps. The family members she met defied easy categorization. Ezekiel appeared to be the patriarch, though his apparent age fluctuated depending on lighting conditions and viewing angle. Other family members were introduced by names and relationships that seemed to shift during conversation. A woman identified as Ezekiel's daughter appeared old enough to be his sister, while someone described as his grandson looked to be nearly the same age as Ezekiel himself. Their conversation was cordial but evasive. The family members answered Dr. Marsden's questions about their history and traditions, but their responses had a quality that made them difficult to remember accurately. She found herself taking extensive notes during the interview, only to discover later that her handwriting became increasingly illegible as the conversation progressed, eventually deteriorating into symbols that resembled no writing system she recognized. "We've always been private people," Ezekiel explained when she commented on the difficulty she was having documenting their discussion. "Our ways are old, older than the settlements in these mountains." Dr. Marsden persisted in her research, conducting interviews with neighboring families and examining historical records in county courthouses and church archives. What she discovered was a pattern of documentation that seemed to actively resist investigation. Records that mentioned the Goins family were invariably incomplete, damaged, or contradictory. Church registers that should have contained birth, marriage, and death records for family members instead showed blank pages or entries written in faded ink that became illegible under examination. Most frustrating was her attempt to create a family genealogy. The Goins appeared in various records dating back to the 1820s, but the relationships between individuals were impossible to establish with certainty. People who should have been deceased, according to historical documents, appeared in more recent records with no indication of how they had survived to such advanced ages. Children were born to parents who, according to available documentation, should have been too old to reproduce or had died years earlier. Dr. Marsden's research notes, preserved in university archives, show her growing frustration with these anomalies. "The Goins family exists in a state that defies conventional historical analysis," she wrote. "They appear to operate according to social and biological principles that I cannot identify or understand." Her investigation took an unexpected turn when she began experiencing phenomena that went beyond mere documentary difficulties. She reported strange dreams that seemed to contain information about the family that she had not discovered through conventional research. Objects in her temporary lodgings would be found rearranged in patterns that resembled symbols she had seen in her unsuccessful attempts to document conversations with family members. Most disturbing, she began to hear voices speaking in unfamiliar languages during the hours between sleeping and waking, voices that seemed to be providing answers to questions she had not yet learned to ask. The turning point came during her final attempted interview with Ezekiel Goins. She had prepared extensively, bringing recording equipment borrowed from the university's new psychology department, multiple notebooks, and even a camera to document the family's living conditions. But when she arrived at the designated meeting location, she found not the familiar residence, but a structure she had never seen before, despite having visited the same spot repeatedly. The building appeared to be constructed from materials that did not quite behave like conventional wood and stone. Surfaces seemed to shift slightly when viewed peripherally, and the interior was lit by sources that cast shadows in directions that defied the apparent position of windows and lamps. Ezekiel received her in what he described as the family's archive, a room lined with books, documents, and objects that appeared to represent centuries of accumulated knowledge. "You've been asking questions about our history," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. What followed was not an interview in any conventional sense, but rather an experience that Dr. Marsden later struggled to describe in rational terms. Ezekiel spoke, but his words seemed to bypass her ears and appear directly in her consciousness. She saw images that might have been memories or visions, showing the family's arrival in the mountains, their early struggles, and the moment when they made their bargain with forces that existed beyond ordinary human understanding. She witnessed scenes from the family's past that revealed the true nature of their success and the price they had paid for it. She saw the gradual transformation of family members as they became something more and less than human, their individual identities blending into a collective consciousness that spanned generations. She understood with terrifying clarity that the Goins family was not bound by normal limitations of mortality, identity, or physical law, because they had surrendered these limitations in exchange for power that operated according to older and more fundamental principles. When the experience ended, Dr. Marsden found herself sitting alone in an empty cabin with no sign that anyone had been present. Her recording equipment had malfunctioned, producing only static and strange harmonics that hurt to listen to. Her notebooks contained pages of writing in her own handwriting that described events and concepts she had no memory of learning. Her camera had somehow exposed an entire roll of film, but the developed photographs showed only darkness, punctuated by geometric patterns that seemed to move when viewed directly. Dr. Marsden returned to Chicago and submitted a final report that recommended discontinuing research into the Goins family. Privately, she never spoke about her experiences in Kentucky, and she carefully avoided any future research that might bring her into contact with similar phenomena. But the attention from government investigators and academic researchers had made the family aware that their traditional methods of concealment were no longer sufficient. The modern world was developing tools and techniques that could potentially expose aspects of their existence that had remained hidden for generations. More critically, their supernatural foundation was beginning to show signs of instability that threatened not just their secrecy, but their survival. The first indication of serious trouble came from their business operations. The impossible productivity that had been their trademark for decades began experiencing fluctuations. Coal mines that had produced consistent yields, regardless of geological limitations, suddenly showed signs of depletion. Manufacturing processes that had operated without the normal constraints of physics started producing defective goods. Financial instruments that had generated wealth through mechanisms that defied economic analysis began showing losses that threatened to expose the supernatural basis of their success. Family members who had appeared ageless for decades started showing signs of mortality. Not normal aging exactly, but a gradual fading that suggested their connection to the forces that sustained them was weakening. Some began experiencing what they called the forgetting, a condition where their memories of family history and the knowledge that had been passed down through generations became increasingly unreliable. Most alarming was the behavior of the entities they had made their original bargains with. The forces that dwelt in the depths of Devil's Backbone Ridge were becoming more demanding, requiring offerings and services that went beyond what the family had previously provided. The boundaries between the human world and the realm of these entities were becoming more permeable, making it increasingly difficult to contain their influence within the family's traditional territory. Ezekiel, who had served as the family's primary intermediary with these forces, found himself caught between the growing pressure from the modern world above and the escalating demands from the ancient powers below. The bargains that had sustained his family for a century were beginning to exact costs that threatened to consume everything they had built. As the modern world crept closer to their ancient domain, the Goins family found themselves facing their greatest challenge yet. The 20th century brought with it forces they had never encountered, technologies that threatened to expose their carefully guarded secrets, and governmental powers that could not be swayed by mere supernatural influence. What had sustained them for generations now demanded prices they were increasingly unable to pay. The first crack in their otherworldly foundation appeared in 1923 when a federal surveyor named Marcus Holloway arrived in Pike County to map mineral rights for a proposed railway expansion. Unlike the scattered locals who had learned to avoid asking too many questions, Holloway possessed both the authority and the stubbornness to demand answers. His instruments detected geological anomalies throughout Goins territory that defied scientific explanation. Coal seams that appeared and vanished depending on who was looking. Underground chambers that registered on seismic equipment but couldn't be located physically. Most disturbing of all, magnetic readings that fluctuated wildly whenever he approached certain areas of their land. Holloway's preliminary reports caught the attention of the United States Geological Survey, who dispatched a full team to investigate. For the first time in their history, the Goins faced systematic scientific scrutiny backed by federal authority. Traditional methods of discouragement proved insufficient. When the surveyor's equipment began malfunctioning in their usual supernatural fashion, the government simply sent more advanced instruments. When researchers experienced the disorienting effects that had deterred previous investigators, they documented these phenomena as subjects worthy of further study rather than warnings to retreat. The family convened in their oldest gathering place, the chamber beneath the original homestead, where generations of their ancestors had made their terrible bargains. The walls pulsed with that familiar, otherworldly energy, but even this sacred space felt different now. The shadows seemed restless, shifting independently of the flickering candlelight. When the eldest Goins attempted to commune with the entities that had empowered their bloodline for so long, the response came not as the usual whispers of dark wisdom, but as something approaching impatience. The voices that emerged from the stone walls carried an edge of hunger that had grown sharper over the decades. Where once these beings had been content with periodic offerings and ritual observances, now they demanded more frequent payments. The supernatural knowledge that had allowed the family to prosper in business and industry came at increasingly steep costs. Each prediction of market fluctuations, each supernatural insight that maintained their competitive advantages, required fresh sacrifices of a more personal nature. Young Goins' children began disappearing from family gatherings, not dead but changed, taken into the deep places beneath the mountains to serve purposes the adults dare not contemplate. The family's legendary longevity, once a blessing that allowed them to accumulate wealth and influence across multiple lifetimes, became a curse as they aged beyond what even their supernatural patrons could indefinitely sustain. Some elders persisted in forms that barely qualified as human. Their consciousness stretched across decades of unnatural existence, their bodies maintained by forces that exacted terrible prices for each additional year. The railway expansion that had brought federal attention to their territory proceeded despite the family's best efforts to obstruct it. Construction crews, protected by government authority and modern communication systems, could not be deterred through traditional supernatural intimidation. When mysterious accidents began plaguing the project, federal investigators arrived with equipment sophisticated enough to detect the supernatural anomalies surrounding these incidents. The Goins found themselves facing a new type of adversary, one that responded to their otherworldly influence, not with fear or confusion, but with scientific curiosity and bureaucratic persistence. More threatening still was the arrival of Dr. Evelyn Marsh, an anthropologist from Harvard University who had heard rumors of the unusual cultural practices preserved in Appalachian isolation. Unlike previous academics who could be discouraged through subtle, supernatural harassment, Dr. Marsh possessed both the intellectual framework to interpret what she observed and the institutional backing to publish her findings. Her initial interviews with local residents revealed patterns of belief and behavior that suggested something far more significant than simple mountain folklore. Dr. Marsh's research methods proved immune to the family's usual defenses. She approached their supernatural manifestations not as phenomena to be feared, but as cultural artifacts to be documented and analyzed. When she experienced the disorienting effects that surrounded Goins' territory, she recorded these sensations as data points rather than warnings. Her academic training allowed her to recognize the systematic nature of what locals attributed to coincidence or mountain strangeness. The breaking point came when Dr. Marsh requested formal interviews with the Goins family themselves. For over 2 centuries, they had maintained their power through careful manipulation from the shadows, influencing events without directly exposing themselves to scrutiny. Now they faced a choice between submitting to academic investigation or taking more direct action to protect their secrets. Either option threatened to unravel the careful balance they had maintained between the human world and the supernatural forces that sustained them. The entities beneath the mountains grew increasingly restless as their human servants faced this unprecedented challenge. The otherworldly voices that had once whispered guidance now spoke in urgent demands. The supernatural bargains that had elevated the Goins above ordinary human limitations required constant reinforcement, and the modern world's intrusion into their domain disrupted the delicate mechanisms through which these agreements operated. Family members began experiencing what they privately called the calling, irresistible compulsions to venture into the deepest parts of their territory, where the boundary between worlds grew thinnest. Those who answered these summons returned changed, if they returned at all. Their eyes held depths that reflected no light. Their voices carried harmonics that made listeners uneasy, and their knowledge extended far beyond what any human mind should contain. Yet even these transformed family members struggled to maintain their supernatural advantages in the face of systematic modern investigation. The Goins' industrial empire, built upon supernatural foresight and otherworldly influence, began showing signs of strain. Business partners noted unusual inconsistencies in the family's previously infallible market predictions. Government contracts that had once flowed to their companies through supernatural manipulation were subjected to new levels of bureaucratic oversight that proved resistant to otherworldly influence. The family's ability to control information and suppress inconvenient records was challenged by emerging communication technologies and federal documentation systems that operated beyond their traditional sphere of influence. Most ominously, other supernatural bloodlines throughout Appalachia began experiencing similar pressures. The modern world's expansion into previously isolated regions was disrupting ancient agreements and territorial arrangements that had persisted for generations. Families who had maintained their own bargains with otherworldly forces found themselves competing for diminishing supernatural resources. The entities that had once seemed inexhaustibly powerful now appeared to be consolidating their influence, choosing which human servants would continue to receive their patronage and which would be abandoned to face the modern world with only mortal capabilities. The Goins realized that their supernatural patrons were preparing for some form of transition, a fundamental change in how these otherworldly forces would interact with the human world. The isolated mountain communities that had provided perfect hiding places for supernatural activity were disappearing as roads, railways, and communication systems connected even the most remote hollows to the broader world. The entities that thrived in secrecy and isolation were being forced to adapt or retreat to even more hidden realms. As 1925 approached, the family faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to sever their supernatural connections and try to survive in the modern world with only their accumulated wealth and influence. This option offered the possibility of preserving some portion of their power while escaping the increasingly dangerous demands of their otherworldly patrons. Alternatively, they could commit themselves more completely to their supernatural bargains, accepting whatever transformations and sacrifices their entities demanded in exchange for continued power in a changing world. The decision would determine not only the fate of the Goins bloodline, but the future of all the supernatural forces that had shaped Appalachian history for generations. In the deep places beneath the mountains, ancient entities waited to see whether their human servants would prove adaptable enough to survive in a world where science and bureaucracy threatened to illuminate every shadow where the supernatural had once thrived unobserved. The choice that loomed before the Goins family in those early decades of the 20th century was not one that could be postponed indefinitely. By 1925, the supernatural foundation that had sustained their empire for over a century began showing hairline fractures that threatened to split their entire existence wide open. The ancient pact that had granted them impossible longevity, prescient knowledge, and otherworldly influence was demanding payments that even their accumulated wealth and power might not be able to satisfy. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The family's coal mines, once impossibly productive, began yielding ore that crumbled to dust within hours of extraction. Their lumber operations discovered that trees they had harvested would regrow overnight, but the wood they had already processed would warp and splinter as though rejecting its separation from the earth. Most troubling of all, their carefully maintained genealogical records began changing on their own, bloodlines rearranging themselves in the ledgers as though the supernatural forces that had shaped their family tree were reconsidering their investments. Samuel Goins, now the undisputed patriarch of the sprawling clan, convened what would become known as the Reckoning Council in the winter of 1925. The meeting took place in the original cabin that Ezekiel had constructed over a century earlier, though the structure had been expanded and modified so many times that its original form was barely recognizable beneath layers of supernatural architecture. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm, and the assembled family members cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies. 23 direct descendants attended that first council, representing every branch of the family tree that had taken root across 5 states. Their appearances told the story of their supernatural heritage more clearly than any written record could. Some bore the elongated limbs and enlarged craniums that marked them as the deep thinkers, those whose minds had been enhanced to process information at inhuman speeds. Others displayed the hardened skin and metallic sheen that identified them as the workers, capable of laboring in conditions that would kill ordinary humans. A few possessed the translucent quality that marked them as the Watchers, able to see through the veils between worlds and monitor threats from both natural and supernatural sources. Samuel himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. Now approaching his 2nd century of life, he appeared to be simultaneously very old and unnaturally young, his features shifting subtly depending on the observer's angle of view. His eyes had taken on a quality that seemed to contain depths that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of his skull, and when he spoke, multiple voices seemed to harmonize within his words. The business of the council began with reports from each family branch about the increasing instability of their supernatural advantages. The mining operations were experiencing what the overseers called time fractures, where entire work shifts would find themselves repeating the same hour multiple times, or discovering that weeks had passed in what felt like minutes. The agricultural enterprises reported that their enhanced crops were beginning to exhibit disturbing characteristics, with corn that grew in perfect geometric patterns and wheat that whispered in languages no living human had ever heard. More concerning were the reports from the family members who served as intermediaries with their otherworldly patrons. These individuals, known within the family as the speakers, described increasingly erratic communications from the entities that had originally granted their supernatural abilities. The messages were becoming fragmented and contradictory, as though the ancient intelligences were experiencing some form of distress or confusion. Some speakers reported that their usual contacts had simply vanished, leaving only empty silence where once there had been clear directives and promises of continued support. The most alarming development came from Martha Goins, Ezekiel's daughter, who had inherited his role as the family's primary liaison with the supernatural realm. Now well into her 70s, but appearing no older than 30, Martha possessed the ability to commune directly with the entities that had shaped their destiny. Her report to the council was delivered in a voice that seemed to emanate from somewhere far deeper than her throat, carrying harmonics that made the assembled family members' teeth ache. "The old arrangements are dissolving," she announced. "The barriers between the worlds are shifting, and our benefactors find themselves pulled toward conflicts that dwarf their interest in our small affairs. They speak of a great convergence, a time when all the bargains struck across centuries will be called in simultaneously. We are not their only investment, and we may not be their most important one. This revelation struck the council like a physical blow. For generations, the Goins family had operated under the assumption that their supernatural patrons viewed them as valuable, long-term partners in some cosmic enterprise. The possibility that they were merely one of many such arrangements, and perhaps not even a particularly significant one, forced them to confront the fragility of their position in ways they had never considered. The discussion that followed revealed the full scope of their predicament. The family's various enterprises had become so dependent on supernatural enhancement that they could not function without it. Their minds reached depths that defied geological possibility. Their timber operations harvested wood with properties that violated the laws of physics, and their agricultural endeavors produced yields that required constant supernatural intervention to maintain. Without their otherworldly advantages, the Goins' empire would collapse within months, leaving them not just powerless, but actively vulnerable to the numerous enemies they had accumulated over the decades. Yet the cost of maintaining their supernatural alliance was escalating beyond their ability to pay. The entities that had once been satisfied with offerings of blood, devotion, and occasional human sacrifice were now demanding something far more substantial. They wanted permanent representatives in the physical world, family members who would serve as anchors to allow their patrons to establish a more direct presence in human affairs. This would require volunteers to undergo a transformation so complete that they would cease to be human in any meaningful sense, becoming living conduits for intelligences that operated according to fundamentally alien principles. The debate that followed split the family along lines that had been developing for years. The traditionalists, led by Samuel's eldest son Jeremiah, argued that the family's supernatural alliance was their greatest asset and that any sacrifice was justified to maintain it. They pointed to the wealth, power, and longevity that their otherworldly patrons had provided, arguing that the family had a duty to future generations to preserve these advantages, regardless of the cost. The modernists, championed by Samuel's daughter Rebecca, contended that the family's supernatural dependence had become a liability in a rapidly changing world. Federal oversight was increasing, scientific scrutiny was becoming more sophisticated, and the social isolation that had once protected their secrets was becoming harder to maintain. They argued that the family should begin the process of weaning themselves from supernatural assistance while they still had the power to do so on their own terms. A third faction, led by Martha herself, proposed what they called the middle path. Rather than either fully embracing or completely rejecting their supernatural heritage, they suggested a gradual transition that would allow them to maintain some otherworldly advantages while developing more conventional sources of power and influence. This approach would require careful negotiation with their patrons and a willingness to accept reduced capabilities in exchange for greater independence. The council sessions stretched on for weeks, with family members traveling back and forth between their various territories to consult with local branches and gauge support for different approaches. The discussions were complicated by the fact that different family branches had developed different relationships with their supernatural patrons. Some had maintained the original compact established by Ezekiel, while others had struck additional bargains or modified their agreements over the decades. As the debates continued, external pressures began mounting. Federal agents investigating the family's business interests reported strange phenomena that defied explanation. Mine inspectors discovered shafts that seemed to extend infinitely downward, with their measuring equipment registering depths that exceeded the diameter of the Earth itself. Agricultural specialists studying the family's crop yields found soil compositions that included elements not found on the periodic table. Most disturbing of all, census workers attempting to document the family's population discovered genealogical records that seemed to change while they were being reviewed, with birth and death dates shifting to maintain consistency with impossible lifespans. The mounting scrutiny forced the family to expend increasing amounts of their supernatural resources on concealment and misdirection. The very abilities that had once made them powerful were now being consumed by the effort to hide their existence from a world that was becoming increasingly difficult to deceive. Martha's communications with their otherworldly patrons became more desperate as she sought guidance on how to navigate the crisis without triggering the complete withdrawal of supernatural support. The entity's response, when it finally came, was both illuminating and terrifying. Through Martha's voice, they revealed that the Goins family was indeed part of a much larger network of supernatural alliances that stretched across the globe and back through centuries of human history. These arrangements were all connected to what they called the Great Working, a cosmic project that required the cooperation of intelligences from multiple dimensions and realities. The current crisis was not unique to the Goins family, but was being experienced by supernatural allies worldwide. The barriers between dimensions were weakening due to factors that the entities themselves did not fully understand, and this instability was forcing them to reconsider their long-term strategies. Some of their human partners would need to be abandoned entirely, while others would be called upon to play more significant roles in whatever was coming. The Goins family, the entities revealed, had been selected for a more prominent position in the Great Working due to their demonstrated loyalty and the strategic importance of their North American territory. However, this elevation would require sacrifices that went far beyond anything they had previously been asked to provide. Not only would they need to offer permanent human anchors, but they would also need to allow their territory to be transformed into what the entities called a confluence point, a location where multiple realities could intersect and overlap. This transformation would make the Goins territory incredibly valuable as a base of operations for supernatural entities, but it would also make it largely uninhabitable for normal humans. The family would need to choose between maintaining their human identity and accepting a role as caretakers of an increasingly alien landscape, or embracing a complete transformation that would grant them incredible power at the cost of their humanity. The revelation forced the council to confront questions that went to the very heart of their identity. Were they still human beings who happened to possess supernatural abilities, or had they already become something else entirely? Did they have obligations to the broader human community, or were there only loyalties to their otherworldly patrons and their own family's survival? Most fundamentally, what did it mean to be the Goins family if they were no longer recognizably human? The debates that followed were unlike anything in the family's history. For the first time, members began questioning not just their current strategy, but the very foundations of their supernatural alliance. Some argued that Ezekiel's original bargain had been a mistake that had condemned subsequent generations to a path they could not escape. Others maintained that their supernatural heritage was what made them special and that abandoning it would be tantamount to suicide. The discussions were complicated by the fact that different family members had been affected differently by their supernatural exposure. Those who had undergone more dramatic transformations found it difficult to imagine existing without their enhanced abilities, while those who had maintained more human characteristics were more open to the possibility of severing their otherworldly connections. As winter deepened and the council sessions continued, it became clear that no unanimous decision would be possible. The family was too diverse, too scattered, and too divided by competing interests and loyalties to speak with a single voice. Samuel, recognizing that his role as patriarch required him to make a decision that would bind the entire family, announced that he would spend the remainder of the winter in communion with their supernatural patrons, seeking guidance that would determine their collective fate. The period of communion that followed would later be remembered as the long silence, during which Samuel disappeared into the deepest chambers of the original cabin and was seen by no other family member for 3 months. During this time, the various branches of the family were left to manage their own affairs while grappling with the uncertainty of their future. Some began quietly preparing for a complete break with their supernatural heritage, liquidating assets and establishing conventional business relationships. Others deepened their commitment to the otherworldly alliance, volunteering to serve as anchors and accepting increasingly dramatic transformations. When Samuel finally emerged from his communion, he bore news that would reshape the family's destiny in ways that none of them had anticipated. The entities had revealed that the choice between human and supernatural identity was a false dilemma. The Great Working required not the abandonment of humanity, but its evolution into something that could bridge the gap between realities. The Goins family would indeed serve as anchors and caretakers, but they would do so as pioneers of a new form of existence that retained the best aspects of both human and supernatural nature. This revelation would set the stage for the most dramatic transformation in the family's history as they prepared to embrace a destiny that would make them something unprecedented in human experience. The revelation had come during the long silence, but revelation and action existed as separate realms entirely. Samuel Goins emerged from his months of communion with the ancient forces bearing knowledge that would fundamentally alter not just his family, but the very fabric of reality in their corner of Appalachia. The time for half measures and careful balance had ended. The family would embrace their true nature completely or face extinction at the hands of powers that had grown tired of their hesitation. The transformation began with architecture. Throughout the winter of 1952, impossible construction projects commenced across Goins territory. Buildings that had stood for generations were torn down and rebuilt according to blueprints that seemed to shift and change as workers examined them. The new structures defied conventional understanding of space and physics. Rooms existed that were larger inside than the buildings that contained them. Hallways stretched for impossible distances, leading to chambers that occupied the same physical space simultaneously. Windows looked out onto landscapes that existed in different seasons, different times of day, sometimes different decades entirely. Workers imported from distant states to avoid local suspicion reported disturbing experiences. Tools would be found arranged in complex geometric patterns each morning, despite being left scattered the previous evening. Concrete, poured in standard rectangular foundations, would cure overnight into elaborate mandala shapes. Most unsettling were the accidents that weren't accidents. Workers would suffer injuries that left them with enhanced abilities. A carpenter who fell from scaffolding and should have died instead found he could see through solid wood, identifying flaws and grain patterns invisible to others. An electrician shocked by faulty wiring discovered he could sense electrical currents through walls and underground cables across vast distances. These workers invariably stayed in the region after their contracts ended, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to remain near the sites they had helped construct. They established small communities on the periphery of Goins territory, becoming unwitting sentries who would report any unusual activity or unwelcome visitors. Over time, their descendants developed their own peculiar traits, as though proximity to the Goins construction projects had introduced mutations that passed through bloodlines. The family's businesses underwent equally dramatic changes. The mining operations delved deeper than any geological survey indicated was possible, following seams of coal that seemed to regenerate themselves. Miners reported working in shafts that descended for miles, where the air remained breathable despite the impossible depth, and where the walls occasionally pulsed with a faint luminescence. The coal extracted from these depths burned with unusual properties, producing heat that seemed to warm not just rooms, but the very souls of those who gathered around such fires. The logging operations expanded into forests that appeared on no official maps. Trucks would drive down established roads and somehow find themselves in pristine wilderness areas that stretched for dozens of miles in every direction. The timber harvested from these phantom forests possessed remarkable qualities. Wood that remained perfectly preserved regardless of weather conditions, that could be shaped by hand as though it were clay, that seemed to grow stronger over time rather than aging and weakening. Agricultural ventures produced crops that challenged basic understanding of biology. Corn that grew in spiraling patterns, with each kernel containing flavors that shifted and changed as it was eaten. Tobacco leaves that, when cured and prepared, produced smoke that induced vivid, shared visions among those who partook. Livestock that seemed to understand human speech and whose offspring were born with unusual intelligence and longevity. The family members themselves underwent the most profound transformations. The children born after Samuel's revelation were markedly different from their predecessors. They possessed capabilities that extended far beyond the precognitive abilities and enhanced intuition that had previously marked the bloodline. These new generations could communicate without speech, sharing thoughts and emotions across vast distances. They aged at different rates, with some children remaining physically young for decades, while others matured rapidly into forms that barely resembled their human origins. Most disturbing was their relationship with time itself. The younger Goins family members seemed to exist partially outside linear chronology. They would reference events that had not yet occurred, demonstrate knowledge they could not possibly have acquired, and occasionally disappear for weeks, only to return claiming that mere hours had passed from their perspective. Family gatherings became surreal affairs where multiple generations would interact, but the participants seemed to be experiencing the same events from different temporal vantage points. The entity that had guided Samuel during the long silence made its presence increasingly known throughout the family's domain. Workers and visitors reported encounters with a figure that appeared differently to each observer but was unmistakably the same presence. Some described it as an impossibly tall human form whose features shifted like smoke. Others saw it as a collection of geometric shapes that moved with purposeful intelligence. Still others perceived it as a sound or sensation rather than a visual phenomenon, a presence that communicated through emotions and impressions rather than words. This entity began to appear not just to family members, but to anyone who spent extended time within Goins territory. It would manifest during moments of crisis or decision, offering guidance that invariably led to outcomes that served the family's expanding influence. A local sheriff facing a difficult investigation would experience a vivid dream showing him exactly where to find evidence that would lead away from Goins' activities. A federal inspector reviewing suspicious business practices would suffer a bout of illness that left him with gaps in memory, losing all interest in his original investigation. The transformation of the region itself accelerated. Areas that had been barren or struggling began to flourish with unnatural abundance. Streams that had run dry for years suddenly flowed with crystal clear water. Hillsides that had been stripped bare by mining operations became covered overnight with forests of trees that appeared to be centuries old. Wildlife returned in numbers that exceeded the land's apparent carrying capacity, and these animals displayed unusual behaviors, as though they were following instructions from some unseen intelligence. Local residents found themselves adapting to these changes in ways that seemed natural at the time but would appear bizarre to outside observers. Farmers began planting by lunar cycles that didn't correspond to any known calendar. Hunters developed the ability to communicate with their prey, engaging in elaborate negotiations that determined which animals would be taken and which would be spared. Children played games that involved manipulating shadows and light in ways that created temporary doorways to other locations. The few outsiders who attempted to document these changes found their efforts consistently frustrated. Cameras malfunctioned in specific ways, producing images that showed ordinary landscapes instead of the remarkable phenomena they had been aimed at. Recording equipment would work perfectly until the moment something truly unusual occurred, then would mysteriously fail or produce only static. Written notes would be found the next morning with text that had changed overnight, describing completely different observations than what had originally been recorded. Government agencies that had been monitoring the family's activities discovered that their surveillance networks were being systematically compromised. Agents would arrive at observation posts to find their equipment had been moved or modified in ways that improved its function but redirected its focus away from sensitive areas. Communication systems would develop mysterious delays, with messages taking hours or days to reach their intended recipients. Most unsettling, agents would sometimes receive detailed reports about their own activities written from perspectives they couldn't identify, as though they were being observed by intelligences far more sophisticated than any human surveillance network. The family's financial empire expanded through mechanisms that defied conventional business analysis. Companies under Goins' control would receive contracts for services that seemed mundane, but involved access to locations and resources that officially didn't exist. Government agencies would issue purchase orders for quantities of materials that exceeded their stated budgets, paid for through accounting systems that balanced perfectly despite the mathematical impossibilities involved. These business relationships created a network of influence that extended throughout the region and beyond. Politicians found themselves supporting legislation that benefited Goins' interests without fully understanding why these particular bills seemed so important. Judges discovered that cases involving the family would be resolved through precedents and legal interpretations that appeared in their minds fully formed, as though they had always known these obscure aspects of law. Military personnel would find themselves reassigned to duties that inadvertently provided protection for Goins' operations, following orders that seemed to come through proper channels but left no paper trail. The transformation was not without its costs. Family members who had struggled with the supernatural aspects of their heritage found themselves completely overwhelmed by the accelerated changes. Several of the older generation simply vanished, leaving behind only personal belongings, arranged in patterns that suggested they had been absorbed into the very fabric of the altered reality surrounding them. Others underwent physical changes that left them barely recognizable as human, their forms adapting to serve functions that seemed to require capabilities beyond biological limitations. The community that had grown up around the family's activities began to fragment as the changes became too dramatic to ignore or rationalize. Some longtime residents fled the region entirely, though they invariably found themselves unable to discuss their experiences with outsiders, as though the memories became inaccessible once they crossed certain geographical boundaries. Others embraced the transformation, allowing themselves to be incorporated into the expanding network of influence and supernatural capability that the family was creating. As 1953 progressed, it became clear that the Goins family was no longer simply a powerful clan that had made bargains with supernatural forces. They were becoming something entirely new, a hybrid form of existence that combined human intelligence and ambition with capabilities that transcended physical reality. The question was no longer whether they could maintain their power and influence, but whether the world they were creating would remain compatible with the broader human civilization that surrounded their mountain domain. The truth is, the shadows and Appalachian hollers still remember these old bargains, and on the darkest nights, when desperation drives good people to bad choices, whispers drift through the mist, offering help at a price. These 5 families found what they sought, but their stories serve as warnings that some hungers can never be satisfied, some debts can never be fully paid, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The mountains are patient, and they're always listening for the next desperate soul willing to make a deal,